welcome to Nelson All Over Cards. Today we have part 2 of our deck building series that I am doing with VillainTheory. How you doing? Welcome.
I'm doing good. Thank you very much. Glad to be back.
Excellent. I'm so happy to have you back on to talk about deck building. So if you missed the previous episode, the link will be down below on the screen somewhere. That talked about the cost curve. We're going to be using some of those ideas, that terminology in today's discussion where we're talking about resources and how to pay for stuff. So VillainTheory, before we get started, can you tell, also, you're famous now. You're on Fantasy Flight website. You wrote an article. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you so much. I wanted to mention it, but I couldn't really mention it. But it was, it's about deck building. So if you haven't seen it, check it out. Fantasy Flight's website. A few little deck building pointers. We'll go into a lot more depth in this video on subjects, but got some useful stuff.
Yeah, that was awesome to see. So that will also be linked down below in the description. But VillainTheory, before we get started, tell everyone where to find you, and then let's talk about resources.
Yeah, so I'm mostly known for deck building. You'll find a lot of my decks on Marvel CDB. If you play this game, you probably know that website. I post a few things here and there on Reddit. You'll see me on the Discords, and now Fantasy Flight Games. Just written one article.
Excellent. Well, super happy to have you on, and I'm happy to talk about resources, which is maybe I don't know if you can call it the most important thing about the entire game, but it is up there top, one of the core things that you need to use. It's how you pay for cards. It's how you play the game. You could ignore it, but at that point, it's no longer a game. So where do we want to start? Start us out.
Yeah, so resources are very important. You can't play most cards if you don't have a resource. You don't get very far. I wonder if it's possible to win without them, but that's definitely not something we should explore here. That'd be a very weird resource video. I think the most simple thing to start with is, when you're playing the game, you might not think about it too much, but every single card in your hand is a resource. And when we're talking about resources, it's important to understand every time you draw your hand of cards in any given turn or round, you are getting 5. Most of the time 5, sometimes 4. It can vary, but your hand size, however many cards you draw, each one of those is a resource, and that's kind of your starting value every turn on your character. And something that ties into that is how cards are costed. And we went over this a little bit in the last video in the cost curve. But let's say I've got my 5 cards, and I want to play a 2-cost card. I need to spend 2 cards, but I also lose the card itself. So I end up, if I'm paying with just from my hand, that 2-cost card is going to leave me with 2 cards from a hand of 5. So, we would call that, free effective resources, or true cost, different terms for it. But basically, when you've got a card in your hand with, the cost 2 on the top, really it's costing you 3 overall. And that's useful information when you're trying to balance out what will pay for what and how things, also just the value of things, but it's very useful to know about resources.
Yeah, and there are 3 different types of resources. When you are looking at paying for cards, the majority of the time, it does not necessarily matter which resources you pay, but there's the physical, which are the punch or the fist resources, the red ones, the mental, which are the science resources, the blue ones, the energy or lightning, or the yellow resources. And those all function the same when you're looking at like a printed cost. If you need to play med team, which costs 3, you have to discard any number, any combination of 3 of those resources. Now there are some that have some cards that have specific requirements, and that's not necessarily what we're talking about, but those are the 3. And then there's the 4th type, which is the wild, that can function as any one of those 3. And again, when we're talking about paying for a card's cost, that functions as just one cost. And what I really like about this game is how the resources, you can pay for cards, but you can also use those resources to interact with the game in different ways. But we're looking at card cost and kind of how to pay for cards. So I guess like the first thing that is in every deck, it's in the first deck that you ever play with Spider-Man, are the doubles, Strength, Energy, and Genius. Talk to me about those. Do we normally run all of those? I typically throw them in almost every single one of my decks, but I want to hear what you, the expert deck builder, want to hear you say that.
honestly, we could just genuinely say, throw all the basic doubles, strength, energy, genius, throw them in your every deck, job done. You could say that, there are exceptions, but I would say they are quite few and far between. Unless you're really trying to deck, but I would say at like a fairly high level. Like, I'd say anyone can try an experiment, see how a deck plays without them. But nine times out of 10, probably 99, out of 100, you're gonna want the basic doubles. When in doubt, include them. Um, it's interesting with how the resource cards work in a way, because you have like 0 and 1 cost cards. And we covered this a little bit in the cost curve about what you might want to make cards fit and spend your hand efficiently. But if I have a double resource card, and all my cards cost 1 or 0, then you're not getting any value. So it's important to keep that kind of thing in mind. I think Drax is a good example. He has a very, very, very cheap, cost curve. We'll say, harkening back to the other video. Most of his cards cost 0 or 1, or can be reduced in some way. So you might think, do I need the doubles with Drax? And the question is, you don't really need them, but he does like cards that use them. But it can get quite complicated. We could go through every single hero, and every single one would play out differently. So there's a few figures I like to use when I'm trying to figure out, what do I really need the doubles? What do I need? And it more pertains to, I think we'll get onto this, the power of cards. But really, it's about how you value, whether you need to pay for 2 cost cards or not, more often than not. So hopefully, with the power of editing and some wizardry, we can see some figures on the screen.
Magic.
With magic, with actual magic. With Doctor Strange's new invocation, we will see basically a list, and on the left side you'll see the amount of cards. So if I have, say, 10 cards that cost 2 each or more, and I have just a fresh deck and I'm drawing from the top, if I have a 5 hand size, we are looking at a 78% chance, practically 80% chance to draw one. And that's very relevant, because if you've got a resource card that gives you 2 resources, you need to see at least 1, 2, or more cost card to pay for it efficiently, to use all the resources it gives you.
Yeah, and I'm going to cut in real quick just to kind of elaborate a little bit on what you just said. Is its efficiency. And so the double resources can pay for a single cost, a 1 cost card. It's just you're losing efficiency at that point. And so when we're looking at that, you can overpay, you lose the excess resource. You can't split those resources into 2 different cards. But that is something that I just wanted to make sure that we stated explicitly, is that even if you draw into that 22% chance and you have the double but not the 2+ card, you're still okay. You can still use that double as a resource. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to make sure that we explicitly said that.
No, that's a really good point. I think that's really valuable information. And yeah, you can pay for a 1 cost card with a double. There is absolutely no issue with that. The argument is, if you're not using both resources, you might as well have, and not have the resource card, have, a card that does something else, because then you have more options.
Yes.
But everyone, with even the best, you could spend years refining this masterpiece deck, and sometimes you're still just gonna draw all your resource cards. You won't be able to spend them all. It happens to everyone, so it's not worth agonizing over. Yeah, we don't talk about Hulk. We will talk about him probably. But yeah, so this chart here is sort of a good way that I use to gauge, mainly I would say for the power of it, but it is relevant for the double resources as well. Even if you're not getting double value from every double resource, you can probably see here you still have like almost a 50% chance with just like just a handful of cards really to get the double value off, and sometimes that's worth it. This might be too technical to get into, but I think it's really interesting to break down what the double resources are in a deck. If I'm bringing strength, genius, and energy into a deck, what that really means for me is every deck pass, basically I'm getting 3 bonus resources. I've got the doubles, I've got all 3 doubles, coming to my hand at some point. So compared to a normal card, that's 1 extra resource for each one. And the more doubles and things you put in, the more extra resources you're getting per deck pass. So that is, I think, something that is key to keep in mind. And the trade-off is every resource card that's in your hand is one less option of what you could, spend your other resources on. Um, it's normally not a big factor, I would say, but if you get a handful of resource cards and you got big problems in front of you, you might be like, okay, what do I do now?
Yep.
So it is a factor, and that is more of a factor, I would say, on the four cost, four hand size, sorry, heroes. You can get two resource cards and two cheap cards, which I think is a scenario we put out in the cost curve video. And you might wish you just had more options rather than money at that point.
Yep. So okay. So all that being said, strength, energy, and genius, starting out as a deck builder, put them in there. And I think where this chart kind of gets even more interesting is when we start talking about the power of cards. And so the power of cards, power of aggression, leadership, justice, protection, and power in all of us, double the amount of resources for that chosen aspect. So the power of aggression generates 2 wild resources for a aggression card, 1 resource for every other card. So how do you use this graph to help pilot your ideas on whether or not you need to include a power of aggression in your red decks versus not, maybe?
There is a technical answer, really, but a lot of the time, honestly, I have a number in my mind, and that number is 10. If I have 10 cards, if I have 10 cards that the power of aggression can pay for, that means 10 red cards that are at least 2 or 3 or 4, Hercules 6, 2 plus cost cards in aggression, that power of aggression can pay for. I'll probably say, it's probably worth bringing a power of aggression here. You don't have to have 10 is the key takeaway. I don't think you have to feel restricted. I must include 10, but that's normally what I'm trying to aim for. If I can make tweaks, if things are close, I've got 2 cards in mind, but one's 2 cost, I might add that in to get up to 10. But you can absolutely do it with honestly 7, 8, 9, any lower than 7. I think I probably wouldn't, but it also varies on your hero. So you might see in this chart, we have 4 cards drawn, 5, 6, different hand sizes, different other cards you're drawing. The heroes with more cards in hand or more ways to draw cards are going to have more chance to put the double, the power of, with an appropriate card. So with a 4 hand size hero, it's tricky because 4 hand size heroes, as we talked about in the cost curve video, like cheaper cards, but they also have less chance to match up the power of. So, you have kind of a dilemma there. I would say if I am going with the power ofs in a 4 hand size hero, I am normally trying to get, maybe 12 rather than 10. But there are other factors, like I said, drawing, how many cards can you draw? And even if you're a 4 hand size hero, if you're flipping a lot, like She-Hulk likes to flip, you're getting that 6 hand size, fairly often as She-Hulk, I would say. But you can see the numbers here, and you can look at the odds. What chances are you happy to take? Some people might be happy to take. I've got I've only got 2 cards that I could pay for. I'll take it anyway. It's really managing what risk you're comfortable managing. How much do you value an option over getting the extra value? And also, how many resource cards do you have in total? Because there are more resources than the doubles. The power ofs. Heroes have them. There are some other ones that have been introduced. And you start to get situations more commonly, as we talked about a minute ago, where you have too many resources and not enough options in hand. But 10 for me is a sweet spot. I think that's a really good chance to get value out of it, where I don't feel bad that I didn't wish I drew this other card that could, help me solve the situation.
Right. So 10 on a 5 card hero. And
Yes.
at 10, are you running, because you're allowed up to 2 of those, are you running 2 at 10? Are you running 1 at 10? Is there any time where you would only run 1, or how does that work?
Normally, if I'm running 1, I'm running 2. But if the deck is really struggling for size, or I think it's borderline, maybe I've only got 7 appropriate cards there, then I will run maybe 1. But normally, if I'm running 1, I'm trying to run 2. So I'd say aim for 2 if you're going to include them, but you're not locked to anything.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting because I've only ever looked at the number of those cards to include and not necessarily taken into consideration the hand size of the hero. So like someone with Iron Man or someone who can get a really huge hand size doesn't necessarily need as many targets as someone like She-Hulk we just talked about. Someone that has a lower hand size, dare I say Hulk, um, to try and match those up, just because there's less of a probability that they do get drawn at the same time. So that's really interesting. Now you talked about the other resource cards, and so are you talking about the cards like band together that generate more resources based on the current state of the game? Or are you talking about like aggressive energy that do additional things whenever you use them to pay, or kind of all of those?
Kind of all of those, and we should probably point out that well, every card is a resource. There is a category of card that is called resource card, and those are cards that you just use to pay for other cards, and they either help you pay for it or give you a bonus and do something when you pay for them. And all those resource cards are used to pay for things. So all of them are, if you have too many of them, even if it's basically, it's just reducing the amount of options you have in your hand. And I think, amount of options you have isn't really talked about enough. When I see videos on deck building, it's more about, it's sort of what we're focusing on here, costs really and things. But, um, depending on what hero you have, you might be really reliant on drawing the right cards at the right time. And you might rather have one less resource if you can solve the problem in front of you.
Mm.
I think that's quite important. So it does encompass every kind of resource card.
Okay, so let's focus on some of these because I do want to talk about some of these with you. So like we have the first one that I want to talk about, the aggressive energy, passion for justice, and defensive energy. I think aggressive energy and passion for justice have a little bit more of are a little bit different than the defensive energy, but the aggressive energy, whenever you play an attack event, the attack event deals +1 damage. Passion for justice, same thing for thwart. Defensive energy, whenever you pay a defense event, you get to draw a card. I like that one. Um, but
Cards are
so
good.
yeah, when are you looking to add these? Also, just real quick, these are all wild resources. So we're talking about the normal heroes, and I think like Nova and some of those, maybe Domino coming up, have are outliers of this conversation. But thinking of just hero A that doesn't necessarily interact with wild resources in any unique way. That's what we're kind of structuring this around. Just wanted to also state that. But aggressive energy, passion for justice, defensive energy. When are you including these, or when are you leaving these out?
Yeah, so it can vary and it depends what you want to do. So a lot of the time I see these as being in competition with the power of cards. Again, a little
Mm,
bit like having too many resource cards, and also a lot of decks are kind of reliant on combos. And if I'm looking to make my combos more consistent or have more resources, that's kind of another sort of tug of war of deck space. Um, but in general, I'm probably looking to sort of see what value you're getting, because the best way I would say to use aggressive energy and passion for justice is to get twice as much value as you might otherwise. And what I mean by that is aggressive energy adds on +1 damage. If you play an attack card that hits two targets, let's say melee 1 by 1, I think it's called. If your attack card is hitting two targets, your +1 damage is actually getting you a net total of 2 extra damage. It's also making cards like 1 by 1 that only trigger if you defeat a minion. I think Precision Strike is another one like this.
mm,
It's
mm-hmm.
actually helping you trigger them. So cards like that, you get a bit extra. You get kind of just twice your money, and it's helping you trigger things. Um, Similar for Passion for Justice, multitasking. Overwatch also duplicates what you get from
Yeah.
a Passion for Justice. Um, some characters have multiple forwarding cards brought in. I think Penny Parker has a forwarding card that targets, can target two schemes. So that's really what I'm trying to fish it for with those. If I've got aggressive energy, you know, dive bomb is probably the obvious one I should mention. I'm probably fishing to have, honestly, it's really, there's not a hard and fast rule, but
Yeah.
I would say, maybe 6 to 8 cards that are really benefiting from it. And it doesn't have to be getting double value. If I'm running Moment of Triumph, I'm getting more healing that way as well as damage, potentially, or Into the Fray, I'm getting more threat removal. But I am looking for, Yeah, five to seven ways to really benefit from that, and you can still spend this on other cards, and they don't even have to be two cost in these cases. They give me a one cost, so there's no harm done.
Yeah. I it is very build specific. Like the aggressive energies for another one that I see and run with is like no quarter, where
Yeah,
you're getting additional overkill damage, which means that you get to draw or potential draw more cards. But anything that relies on excess or multi-target attacks, I love that. I have never run Passion for Justice. I think that's more me being a solo player
yeah.
and just I don't the cards that I have to remove threat are typically enough. I don't usually need to up that in a solo player setting. So I don't know if you
Yeah.
have any experience in like a multiplayer setting, how that works differently.
I have used Passion for Justice and I have used it in multiplayer. And there's a reason I talked more about aggressive energy, and it's a lot of the reason you're saying, because in solo, you normally have the threat removal if you're in Justice. And in multiplayer, what happens is you generally want the more expensive threat removal events. What's very popular right now, if you have the cards for it, is Crisis Averted and Overwatch.
Mm-hmm.
Slap down Overwatch, and what that does is it doubles your, you can put forwarding you put on one event on one scheme to another. Um, and that kind of comes down to where I think the passion for justice competes with the power of justice. And if I'm putting in expensive cards to do big forwarding in multiplayer, I'm probably going to the power of justice first and passion for justice as like a secondary if I think I need a little bit more extra. Some scenarios it's better than others. I think it's Project Wide Awake comes with 3 or 4 side schemes,
Yeah.
depending on if you're on campaign mode. And suddenly there, if I can play something like Ready Played Card Even the Odds, hits
Mm-hmm.
all side schemes, um, you know, does that one I don't use that card very often, but
It is
cards that
even the
scale up
odds,
in that
yeah.
regard, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it scales on
Um,
player count.
so Passion for Justice definitely more situational than aggressive energy. And the one we didn't talk about actually was defensive energy.
Yeah. I
Um,
I love protection and I never find myself playing defensive energy. I I don't know if that is I am leaning too far away from the events and I just haven't used the chart that you've provided of making sure because you can use that same chart with this idea, right? You can run 2 defensive energies in a deck. And so you can use the same chart and just change out the number of 2 cost cards and just put defense events because it can pay for a defense event and you get to draw a card after you pay for that. And so the only times I've ever really done this is when I can manually make sure that I can have a defense event and this available when I draw it. And typically, what that looks like is like a Jocasta, where I can have a defense event on the table ready to go. So whenever I draw like the defensive energy, I can pay for it. But for some reason, I just find myself not running with that, and just like you were saying, I'd rather have the flexibility of having another card pay for that rather than the probability of drawing into both of those. Am I thinking about that wrong? Or
No, no, no. I think that's really interesting perspective, and I think a lot of players, even myself to some degree, do agree with that. Defensive energy is very interesting in that it worked differently to. It was released kind of alongside the passion for justice and aggressive energy, and it's sort of the defensive version, but it doesn't boost up your defenses. It just kind of rewards you for playing them. Um, and one of the interesting things is about protection is the tug of war between I want enough defense events to be consistent, but I don't want too many defense events so my entire hand is defense events and now I can't do anything.
right.
Um, so I think your option with defensive energy, a lot of the time it comes down to, do I want to potentially get card draw when I play my defense event, or do I want to make sure I've got the right options in hand? So that's kind of one of the decision points I would say there. Something I think is interesting about defensive energy, which I don't think a lot of people realize, and they have confirmed this with rulings on from other resource cards. But even if you don't pay for the card with defensive energy, as long as if you play a 0 cost defense event, for example, you don't have to pay for it, but you can overpay for cards in Marvel Champions. You're allowed
Mm.
to. So if I'm playing a 0 cost Defiance, which I do on Shadowcat quite frequently as an example, I can just throw defensive energy in there, and although it's not paying for it, I'm swapping a defensive resource card for just another card. So you do have some flexibility there. Where as long as you're playing one defense event, even if you've got Nerves of Steel and that's paying for it, you can still cycle it for another card, which I think is an interesting use.
That yeah, okay, that's interesting. I never thought about that interaction of overpaying. Um, and that can also lead to the flexibility, because what I found is that have started to prefer those zero cost defense events, just because, now I'm paying with 20% of my hand rather than 40% of my hand, and that's just a lot easier to stomach
Yep.
than using all of my resources for my defense event. And I guess the other thing is that also leans into my normal solo play, right? I'd rather have the flexibility than the coincidence, whereas if you're playing at a 4 player and you're defending for multiple people at the same time, then maybe that is worth it, because you're probably running a higher skew of defense events, and so you have a higher likelihood, going back to your chart, to sync those up. So that's really interesting. Yeah, I never thought about that, but cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't say for defense events there's a specific amount I'm looking for defensive energy. I think in that case, multiplayer, it's more friendly toward it. It probably is like I probably am looking for 7 or 8 minimum, if I'm honest. But multiplayer is more friendly, as you say. I think that's a great point. But I tend to see defensive energy as more of a filler card. If I think I've got hit all my things I want to hit, and I've got the defensive events to hit it, that's when I sort of think about putting it in.
Gotcha. Okay, so I think I like that discussion. Now let's talk about the ones that came out before that. I think Audacity, Determination, Innovation. So this was kind of the other series of resource cards that we had before that. Audacity, when you spend it, you deal a damage to the villain. Determination, remove a threat from the main scheme. Innovation, I believe you heal an ally, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, that seems good. Turns out keeping allies on the table is good. So talk to me about these. They differ, but kind of in the same vein. But what are your thoughts around the Audacity, Determination, Innovation lineup?
These ones I would say are even more niche in a way. But it can vary. They're quite interesting, the resource cards. Again, I think the biggest mark against using them more commonly is the power of cards are so good.
Yeah.
And combining them, if I've got the 3 doubles, that's all well and good. If I've got, the power ups and I'm up to 5, if I include more than I'm up to 7. If the hero comes with some, you start to get half, a quarter of your deck is now resource cards, and that can lead to, there is such a thing as too much resources. But they have interesting uses. It's in Audacity, for example, is the aggression card that I think you pay for a card with it and it does 1 damage to the villain. Generally, I'm going to say I hate this card. I don't think it's good. Just damage you can only put on the villain is very restrictive. And it doesn't matter if the villain's got 12 or 11 health if you've lost the game, or that big minion is still out there. So I feel like most games don't come down. Some do, but most games don't come down to you doing the last single point of damage perfectly.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I land with Audacity. So I don't tend to run it in any kind of normal deck, solo or multiplayer. However, I think there is a niche for it in rush decks where you're looking to squeeze out any extra value you can for the villain. So my advice for Audacity would be, if you're looking for a rush deck, you've got a couple of slots, just for Audacity and one. You can only put, I think these are max 1 per deck.
Yeah.
And that will get you just a little bit extra damage on the villain where it could matter. Determination. Go on.
The other place that I've seen Audacity run frequently is in like a high tough scenario where the villain is generating toughs, because it's when you spend it. It's before the event actually goes off. And so again, if the villain's sitting at tough, I'm trying to think of what, it's eluding me right now, but I mean Magneto gets a good amount of toughs, but there are a couple of villains out there that the Audacity can ping that tough before your big event. And I've seen it also does not have to be an attack event or anything. It's whenever you spend it, you get the benefit. But I agree. I very rarely run any of these. I kind of forgot about Determination, to be honest with you. So tell me about Determination.
Well, I'll just say I think you're right about Audacity. I think Thanos is another character with a lot of toughs. And I think that might come down to your hero. Some heroes can easily find the damage and ping it. Other ones that hit in big chunks, that's when toughs become a problem. But yeah, we can move on to Determination. This kind of suffers from the passion for justice problem in some regards in solo, whereas if I'm solo justice, especially if I'm running cards like clear the area, making an entrance, things that want you to remove the last threat. Determination can, if the villain has added on one threat to the scheme that turn, you play determination. Well, that's kind of, you then got too much threat removal from that perspective. So it suffers a little bit in, you don't necessarily need it in solo. Some decks you do, but in general, I would say most Justice decks don't. And I think it also suffers, in where you can place it. In multiplayer, I think it gets a little bit better. But again, I would call it more of a filler option. I would say if you're like, okay, I'm at 38, 39 cards, what can I do? Put determination in there. If a character particularly likes wild resources or some type of resource, that can also be a good place for these cards. But it's not something it's not something you don't generally deck build around determination or audacity. You're using those to support stuff. Whereas, if you put aggressive energy in, you're like, oh yeah, I can add cards that synergize.
Right.
Whereas determination, nothing really will synergize specifically.
And so real quick, characters that build around a specific resource. So does the conversation change when you're looking at like Captain Marvel? Or yeah, Captain Marvel, who has, she wants those lightning resources. She wants to be paying for these. These are wild options. Or are you still just leaning into, we have a giant card pool now, just add the flexibility that are those energy resources into your deck over something like this?
I really think it varies. I think what's the most important, and I said this in the cost care videos, I think having the right options is generally the most important thing. To have the cards that do what you want. She does like the energy resources. You can play her without focusing too heavily. I mean, you probably do want to like lean into them, but it's not something I'd go out of my way for. Specifically, energy or wilds too much. I wouldn't think, oh, I'm playing Captain Marvel, I need determination.
Okay.
Especially with the full card pool. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Innovation, I have played. I have played Innovation a lot more than any of the other, well, besides the power ofs and the doubles, but Innovation heals the damage from an ally. Tell me about this one.
Yeah, this card is really good. Basically, healing for allies is more valuable than healing for identities. I don't think this is talked about too often. But you'll see it in the way certain cards are costed. I think the designers are mostly aware of this. When you heal an ally, what you get is potentially another use of them. Depends on how much consequential damage they take, but most of them take one consequential damage. So healing them for one means you get another use out of them. And if you've got a really powerful ally, maybe a Voltron ally, you've put upgrades on, you've got a really, the Iron Man ally is a good example. They are particularly Captain Marvel from Spider-Woman's signature ally. They're just extremely good. If you're playing Drax in leadership for some reason, Innovation for Mantis is good. Yeah.
If you're playing Drax in leadership for some reason, I love how casual that sentence was. It's just hilarious for me. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Just like, that's funny.
It happens. Had a conversation the other day about Drax and Justice. People think protection, sometimes aggression. You play whatever you like. I'm just trying to think of high value allies for healing, but yeah. I like Innovation a lot. It's kind of, in a way, similar. Leadership does have some healing options. United We Stand springs to mind. First Aid as a basic card is very good, but being able to get that one healing, it's not even a zero cost card. As we talked about at the beginning, that's kind of effectively one resource to play zero cost. You've lost that card from your hand. Innovation, you're paying one resource towards something else and you're getting that healing. I think it's very, very useful. There is a protection sort of equivalent that I think heals your hero. I can't remember the name of it at the moment, but
that's how good it is.
ally healing is a lot more valuable, and as leadership, you're likely to have several allies out. Whereas protection, you might well just be at full health. You've only got one character. I think it's locked to the hero. It's been a little while since I used it.
It's preservation.
Preservation. That one, you could run it alongside Dauntless, which is a card that gives you retaliate if you're at your starting hit points or above. But generally, Innovation makes it into not a lot of my decks, but a decent amount. And that's just, it's not so much as about how many allies you have or anything like that. It's more about having allies worth healing, where that one healing, turns into a lot of output. So I'd say about that.
Okay. And then I want to, so having a lot of allies is also, I feel like leadership has a lot of like really interesting resource cards, but band together is kind of, I think of
Mm,
almost the opposite of this, right? Not necessarily, but just in my mind, this is how I think about them. Innovation heals the allies. Band together generates a wild resource per ally you have up to 3. So if you're running like an ally swarm, this can get really good. However, I have found that I am running less and less of these because usually by the time I have my allies out there that are doing whatever they need to be doing, I don't necessarily need that 3 resource. And it doesn't help you build. If you draw one in your opening hand, it's nothing. It doesn't have a printed resource on it. And so is Band Together something that you're running a lot?
no. So let me go into some detail
Cool.
there.
Okay.
When we could leave it there. No, no. It is a very powerful card. It has a lot of very powerful possibilities, and I think a lot of people hearing me say no are going to be like, "What? You're not?" I like the card, and when it was first announced, I remember it was previewed. It came with Mad Titan's Shadow. I remember, I think it did anyway. It was around that time, and I was looking at this card, and I was like, my eyes almost, popped out. I was like, 3 resources, 1 card. Anyone can take this. This is incredible. But I think you hit the nail on the head there. Um, because you have to have an ally in play to begin getting value, okay, you could just play that turn 1 and then use it as a 1 resource card. But that could just be the power of leadership or, the
Yep.
power in all of us. It could be anything else. It could be a better option that you could open the game with. So it very much comes down to resources in your hand taking away from options you have. But this is a conditional one where it won't even give you 1 resource unless you've got something out there.
Right.
So there is the diminishing, I can't talk diminishing kind of return in some respect. And like you say, if you've got a lot of allies out there, you're already in a very strong position. You've probably, got more than enough money. I feel like this is kind of almost a toxic term for it, but I feel like it's more of a win more card.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're ahead, it gets you further ahead. But if you're behind, let's say you're under massive pressure, there's a bunch of minions, Magneto's bearing down on you. You just had to block with your last ally because not only did the encounter card make him attack you, but that gave him a magnet counter that made him attack you again. And your allies are just, there's bodies everywhere.
Yeah.
And then you've
there.
got band together and you're like, well, I guess it looks pretty. So band together is a card that gets better the better you're doing, but the better you're doing, the less you're in need of resources. I think this is generally an interesting topic. I could have even opened with this earlier about how I calculate the doubles. You can deck build to push the potential of your deck up in terms of the ceiling to get maximum output, but you've also got kind of the floor. Like, what does your best turn look like compared to your worst turn?
Ooh,
And
yeah.
band together makes your worst turn look even worse, potentially, but it can make your best turn look really good. So you start to get, you might have extremely good turns with it, but you'll then get some worse turns with it.
Mm-hmm. And I would argue that high variance in a deck is a bad thing, right? If your flow is I can't talk either. If your floor is low and your ceiling is high, that's worse than having consistent mediocre turns in
It depends.
at least a solo game, right? Because you need the consistency, and that's what's really going to help you with presenting the problem or solving the problems that are presented for you. High variance and a lot of just things in life is bad, and I think in Marvel Champions and a deck build is also bad a lot of the time.
Yeah. It depends what you're aiming for in some respects. Because let's say you're struggling with a villain, you might go for a riskier strategy, and you might lose 3 times but win the 4th time. Whereas with a lower ceiling, you might just not be able to win at all. I think this goes a lot in sports. A bit of an off topic, but you can go with a risky play style and steal a game off someone, but you won't win a tournament with that style because eventually you will lose. So
Right.
it kind of comes down to how you're prioritizing what you're doing. Do you want to lift your maximum potential up to win that way, or do you want to bring your lowest kind of up to cross the minimum you need to succeed every time? It's a card game. Every time is, a little bit of an exaggeration. You always got a random problem, random things.
Right.
But yeah, so that's
One
where
of the-
band together lands for me.
Yeah, and one of the things that I do want to mention before we move from Band Together is I do like running Band Together in decks with a lot of villain attachments that require a specific sort of resource to pay for those, because it is effectively with two allies on the table of Vibranium, which we'll talk about hero resources here in a second. But it is a way, spend one of each resource. If you have three allies, that one card can clear that. Now, that is more looking at scenario specific and not necessarily deck specific builds, but that is probably my favorite use of that card. Rather than a win more, it's also just increasing the flexibility. Now I'm, again, getting rid of 20% of my hand to kill an attachment rather than 60% of my hand.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I don't know. Yeah, I think in a way it is helping you win by doing that. It is. I don't know if I call it a win more, but you do have to set up to get to that point. But it's still useful. Wilds, while all these resources in general that provide wilds are useful actually for attachments, because a lot of them have very specific requirements. And if you can get band together ready for that point, no, I agree, that's really nice.
Cool. So the last leadership resource card, which we can touch on pretty quickly because I think it kind of has the same discussion, is effective leadership. Can you tell me about this one?
Effective leadership is pretty simple card. You play when you're playing an ally, you spend it, and that ally gets a +1 to its fort and attack. So
for that round, right?
For that round, yes, yeah. I believe it's to the end of the phase. Not that you used them much in the villain round anyway, but yeah. So you play the ally with it, and it gets a stat boost. So you've got your resource like any other card, and now your ally is hitting harder. Again, got to compete with power of leadership, and this is the band together thing. I'll just back to band together very briefly. Potentially three resources, but sometimes one or zero versus always two. Toward it has to be the right kind of card, but you're probably running that in leadership. But similar to
similar in my mind to like the audacity or the aggressive energies or the passion for justice. Are you going to have that combo in your hand? Are you going to have the ally that you want to play plus this card in your hand? And is that worth it? And typically, I think it's less often played or less often set up than like the aggressive energy, because like aggressive energy, if I'm running 7, am I running 7 allies in a deck? Yes, there are decks that do that, but typically that's a lot of allies in a deck. And so am I going to be able to have these at the same time? Now I think the med lab kind of changes the equation a little bit, because that makes an interesting idea. No, okay, tell me.
Interesting point here. Aggressive energy in that is a really good comparison, because what I like to do with aggressive energy is I'm always looking to get extra value. I want to play it on 1x1 and hit 2 targets. I want to, maybe I'm playing Gambit, Royal Flush, get 3, extra damage off of it.
Yeah.
And in a similar way of effective leadership is I want to ready the ally up again to use its stat boost again. That is the way I like to use that card. And the problem with Medlab, you will hit effective leadership.
Oh,
you'll get a bonus, exhausted. But you come in exhausted.
Yep, I always forget that part. Oh yeah, good call. Okay, yep. But yeah, okay. Sorry, command teams, get readies. That's where I was going next. So you can get multiple uses out of effective leadership if you can get multiple readies.
Yes. Again, it's specific to readying decks, but you can do things like the new X-Men instruction card. You can get a more consistent level of allies. I kind of like this card for Lockjaw. I don't know if it's really worth running out of your way, but if Lockjaw's in your discard pile, you've always got a target for effective leadership. It's a little fun interaction, but in general, if I'm running a lot of readies, I might think about effective leadership. But again, it's only if I've got the space. I think in general, this is a card that is lower priority to me than having the right options in the deck. But it's nice to have if I can fit it in there.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so those are the resource cards, and now I want to talk about the hero resource cards, because there are hero specific cards that are all kind of interesting. We're not going to necessarily go into every single one of them like we did with the aspect. We don't have any basics, do we? That kind of just thought
we have everyday hero.
Oh yeah, no, we don't have any basics.
Good answer.
Everyday hero, I honestly don't think that is worth talking about. It is a bad card.
Yeah, the bonus is just so situational. There are you can go out of your way to make it useful, but generally, unless maybe you're Nova and you really need the wilds, it's
Yeah.
not something I'm going for.
Okay. So the hero resource cards and talking about some of those and how those affect the discussion that we just had and when you are or when you are not adding some of those into your deck. And so talk to me about hero resource cards. What excites you when you look at a hero kit and maybe they have a resource card? What's running through your mind when you see something like a vibranium or a energy absorption or something like that?
These cards are generally, I will say, better than the aspect ones. Power ups are good; they can come close, but generally, the beauty of the hero ones is you can spend them on any kind of card and still get that bonus. There might be exceptions for some I'm forgetting, but generally, you know, I'm looking at one of these cards. I'm thinking, how can I get the most out of it? Uh, Leadership came along with a little ally called Beast. You might have heard of. Gets you a resource
Oh my
card.
gosh.
Um, he's really good with the hero ones because they tend to get more value and you can spend them more easily. Um, so yeah, I'm a huge fan of almost all the hero ones. They're just all so good. Something I'm trying to keep in mind with them, which kind of always harkens back to don't want too many resource cards, is now this has increased your base resource cards. Um, and most heroes I would think only have two of these in their deck. I think I believe salvage for rocket. I think energy absorption, limitless strength. I believe there's two of each of those. But Black Panther with vibranium has three, and the upper limit of resources I'm looking to run in a deck. I can run 9, but normally I'm running 7, I would say. I like to have the option. So 7 is normally the hard cap. And if I'm a 4-hand size hero, sometimes it's 5, just because you get a handful of resource cards, you get stuck. So I love hero resource cards, but I'm also a little bit more cautious toward the resource cards I'm adding because of it. But in general, they're really, really good.
Okay, so when you're looking at Black Panther with a vibranium, he has three of those. Do you that hard cap was 7? So are you looking at keeping the doubles and then maybe adding a power of, or are you looking at those vibraniums taking the spot of the energy shrink genius and then playing around with the the other resources that we've been talking about in the video, or does it kind of depend like everything in this game?
In a way, it depends on everything in this game. So I'm gonna throw you a little extra third kind of option here. In that, what you can do is if you've got too many resource cards, what you really need to invest into is card draw to make sure you've got somewhere to
Okay.
put it. Um, there is a Black Panther. We'll call it a problem. We'll call it a challenge, a obstacle, a hurdle to overcome. Where sometimes you build a lot of upgrades into him, you have them all out on the board, and suddenly you've got all these resource cards rotating and nothing left to spend them on. I think that's quite common with Black Panther, especially among
Especially the
certain
precon.
heroes. Yep, a lot of protection stuff to start with, protection upgrades. So generally, I am more cautious with adding extra resources to Black Panther, who gets free vibranium. But I will still add them. But I will tend to, because he's got vibranium and can pay for things. He can only pay for Avengers Mansion, and he's getting more card draw. Then we move on the graph up to the 6, as a baseline every turn, or 7 if you start Alter Ego,
Mm,
that kind of thing. Um, but sometimes they're just less necessary. So if I'm running something I ran recently is Hone Technique Black Panther, Vibranium, the wild resources are really good there.
yeah.
So there I might stretch and also include the power of aggressions, but I also might rather have attacks. You kind of be flexible with what you need, what you're trying to do. So I wouldn't say I never take the power ups, I don't replace them, but I am always more cautious.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have done with Black Panther is I've removed those if my cost curve has skewed down, or if my cost curve, I can skew the cost curve up because now I have 6 doubles in
Yeah.
6 flexible doubles. They don't have to be justice cards; they can be any card. And so I love the Black Panther leadership with just the high cost allies. I think that's a lot of fun. I don't know if it's good, but it's fun. And Black Panther has a fairly decent way to protect his allies, just like by defending himself, and so you can run all these really cool allies. So I think Vibranium was a crazy card to put in the core set. That was fun. um, and then yeah, so does the conversation around like the Vibranium, where you have 3 of the doubles, how does that transition or change when you're looking at like a limitless strength or a energy absorption from Captain Marvel, where you get 2 triple resources.
It's interesting because Captain Marvel's kind of got a cheat code. She
Yep.
has, I think it's called Energy Channel built in. So what you can do is, if you don't have a good target for those free resources, is you can just put them in Energy Channel as damage for later. Uh, um, but she also has a lot of card draws, so you generally are finding something for it anyway. But no, it is a good point. I think the Hulk, he has so many expensive cards for being a 4 hand size hero. I'm generally not looking to try and put too much extra in to hit limitless strength. That is really my Hulk smash enabler. if I get 2 resources out of it, still that's great.
Yeah.
Captain Marvel, she does like the expensive cards. She runs it well, so I do trend a little bit higher for her. And I do see, back to Black Panther briefly, I do see some people, if they're running a very low cost curve deck, they might just not include the doubles.
Right.
I think I normally would still,
Okay.
but you do have the option where you could potentially do that, which is interesting.
You
I
would
think
include the doubles, but not necessarily the power ofs. If you're
correct,
if you're
yeah.
skewing low. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Most of
Those are the
yeah,
ones you would cut. Interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Um.
I
Oh
think
my
the
gosh.
only hero
Oh.
resource card that is not a double is, I mean, I could be forgetting one, but I think it's Stroke of Genius on Ironheart.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a mentor, so which is useful. She likes mental resources, which is something I might lean into her a bit more. Started the video we talked about. But for her, I'm generally not worrying about her hero resource. I'm just wanting it as much as I can get it.
Yeah. And that one gives you a progress counter, which is her whole shtick. And then, like, similar to molecular acceleration for Gambit, where he gets a charge counter. I love those cards where they're just accelerating what you want to be doing, especially in Ironheart, because she can level, if she gets those early, she can level up really, really quickly,
Mm.
and then Ironheart becomes Ironheart and wins. So
Yep. Yeah. Won't go into too much on Ironheart, but the way I can actually value that card is it's a resource when you use it. It actually draws you a card as well, and it gives you a progress counter. And I normally, we could go into it, but I normally value a progress counter as about 1 resource. So I almost consider that as a triple resource card in value, but it's a
yeah,
1 in how you pay for stuff. So it's a little bit more complicated. You can do that similar with Gambits. It's a double resource card, but you're getting the charge counter. Normally it comes to 1 extra damage. It's a little bit, it's 2 and a bit, and it's very useful. So they're very
yeah,
strong.
yeah. They're really strong, and I think kind of the summation, if I can try to do that, and then I want you to correct me if I'm understanding the conversation correctly, is that hero resources are really good, and
Mhm.
most of the time still run the doubles with the hero resources, and that these are typically taking the spots of the power ofs, of the audacities, of the other resource identity, or the aspect specific resource cards. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, that is correct. And that's not to say never run the power ofs in these
Mm,
characters, because you can absolutely go up to 7, even 8, even 9. You can go up to these amounts, but just a pinch of extra caution with it. But absolutely, you can do that. Yes, yeah.
and when you're doing that, you want to make sure you have a couple of things, either large hand size like an Iron Man. Well, that doesn't really make sense because he doesn't have the resources. Large hand size, or the card draw, or a resource sink, which we'll talk about in our next video, where you have an
Mm.
out if you are over costed or over resourced in your deck.
Yes, no, resource things are a very interesting topic that we'll save, but Black Panther likes resource things. We'll say that.
Excellent. Okay, anything else that we want to talk about in hero resources before we tease the next video and sign off?
I don't think so. Just if you're ever doubtful using your hero resource, just
Just do
I
it.
would use that. Just use it.
Yeah, there really aren't bad ones. Maybe would limitless strength be the closest to the worst one in your mind, just because of the 4 hand size and not necessarily having a target for it?
I like limited strength. I'm not gonna lie to you. I just like it.
Yeah.
As long as you've got a 1 cost card, you can spend it. I think
Right.
that is one of the ones you have to be. Hulk is one of the ones I will skip the power of the most on, and I know conventionally people think of him as being very poor, but just because I think he values having options so much more than other
Yeah.
characters. So that is
Yeah. Okay.
mm.
That's a really, yeah. I would have never thought of that. That's so cool. Awesome. Well, thank you. Okay, cool. So, next video, we're going to be talking about resource generators and resource sinks. that means cards on the table that generate a resource, probably Coin Carrier, Helicarrier, those cards come to mind, and resource sinks where, like we were kind of talking about Captain Marvel with her energy channel, where you can throw excess resources or have additional ways to spend them. I'm excited for that. That's going to be out in the next Enter X weeks here, which I don't ever plan to fix that and edit. It will always just say Enter X weeks here because I just don't know. But that will be out. I am excited to talk about those. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And before we sign off, Phil, can you tell everyone where they can find you one more time?
Yes, if you're looking for anything I've done, you're looking for my decks, you can find them on Marvel CDB. I have the same name there, VillainTheory. I post things on Reddit, every so often. You'll see me on Discord, anywhere I can talk. You'll hear me going on about decks.
Excellent. Well, it was great having you on. Hopefully this video was interesting and informative for you all, the viewers, on resources. I know it was for me. I'm excited to go and run more Audacities in my deck because that's what the TLDW was for this video. Alrighty. Thank you all. Have a good one. See you around. Peace.